Hello everybody, welcome to the Praetorian. This is Roger Hansen, and today I will be doing another reading. It comes from another note that I have on Facebook, which I am transferring to video form. It's about Immanuel Kant. He is an educator from the 1800s. It was a note that I'd taken on May 6th of 2009, and like I said, I'm wanting to change my notes from Facebook over to video form and delete them off of Facebook. So with that being said, I am going to get to the reading, and I hope you enjoy it. So here is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was born on April the 22nd of 1724 in Königsberg, Kingdom of Prussia. He died February the 12th in 1804 at the age of 79 in Königsberg, Kingdom of Prussia. His school tradition, Kantianism, Enlightenment philosophy. His school tradition was Kantianism, Enlightenment philosophy. Okay. His main interest was epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, notable ideas, categorical, imperative, transcendental idealism, synthetic, a priori, noumenon, sapere aude, and nebular hypothesis. He was influenced by Wolff, Tettons, Hutcheson, Empiricus, Montaigne, Hume, Descartes, Malebranche, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Rousseau, Newton, Emanuel, Swedenborg. Influenced Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Peirce, Herschel, Husserl. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation on some of them. Some of them I haven't even heard of. Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Sartre, Cassirer, Habermas, Rawls, Chomsky, Nezik, Karl Popper, Kierkegaard, Jung, Searle, Michael Foucault, Hannah Arendt, Karl Marx, Giovanni Gentile, Karl Jasper, Hayek, Bergson, Orsted, A.J. Ayer, Emerson, and Weininger. Okay, so Immanuel Kant, IPA, April the 22nd, 1724 through 12 February 1804, was an 18th century German philosopher from the Prussian city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, Russia. He is regarded as one of the most influential thinkers of modern Europe and of the late Enlightenment. His biography is The Young Scholar, The Silent Decade, Kant's Kant's later years, Kant's philosophy, Kant's theory of perception, Kant's categories of the understanding, Kant's schema, moral philosophy, the first formulation, the second formulation, the third formulation, idea of God, idea of freedom, aesthetic philosophy, political philosophy, anthropology, influence, tomb and statue of Kalmagrad, bibliography, footnotes, and you see also reference and further reading, a general introduction to Kant's thought, biography and historical context, collections of essays on Kant's theoretical philosophy, on Kant's practical philosophy, on Kant's aesthetics, other work on Kant, contemporary philosophy with a Kantian influence. Okay, the biography. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg as the fourth of 11 children. 5 of them reached adulthood. He was baptized as Immanuel, but later changed his name to Immanuel. Instead of Emmanuel with an E, it's Immanuel with an I. After he learned Hebrew. This was after he learned Hebrew. He spent his entire life in and around his hometown, the capital of Prussia at the time, never traveling more than 100 miles from Königsberg. His father, Johann Georg Kant, who lived between 1682 to 1746, was a German craftsman from Memel, at the time Prussia's most northeastern city, now Klaipėda, Lithuania. His mother, Anne Regina Porter, who lived between 1697 to 1793, was born in Nuremberg, was the daughter of a Scottish saddle and harness maker. In his youth, Kant was a solid, albeit unspectacular student. He was raised in a Pietist household that stressed intense religious devotion, personal humility, and a literal interpretation of the Bible. Consequently, Kant received a stern education, strict, punitive, and disciplinary, that favored Latin and religious instruction over mathematics and science. The young scholar. Kant showed great application to study early in his life. He was first sent to Collegium Frederiциanum and then enrolled in the University of Königsberg in 1740 at the age of 16. He studied the philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff under Martin Knudsen, a rationalist who was also familiar with the development of British philosophy and science and who introduced Kant to the new mathematical physics of Newton. Knudsen warded Kant off the theory of present harmony, regarded as the pillow for the lazy mind. He also warded the younger scholar off idealism, negatively regarded by the whole philosophy of the 18th century, and even after the creation of the theory of transcendental idealism, Kant refuted idealism in the second part of his major work, Critique of Pure Reason. His father's stroke and subsequent death in 1746 interrupted his studies. Kant became a private tutor in the smaller towns surrounding Königsberg, but continued his scholarly research. In 1749 saw the publication of his first philosophical work, Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces. Kant published several more works of scientific topics, becoming a university lecturer in 1755. The subject he lectured was metaphysics, and he had been lecturing it for almost 40 years, even after his break-off with metaphysics. The textbook for the course was written by A.G. Baumgarten, the author of the term aesthetics in its modern meaning. In the Allgemeine Naturgeschichte, 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 in 1755, Kant laid out the nebular hypothesis, in which he deducted that the solar system formed from a large cloud of gas, a nebula. He thus attempted to explain the order of the solar system, seen previously by Newton, as being imposed from the beginning by God. Kant also correctly deducted that the Milky Way was a large disk of stars, which he theorized also formed from a much larger spinning cloud of gas. He further suggested the possibility that other nebulae might also be similarly large and distant disks of stars. These postulations opened new horizons for astronomy, for the first time extending astronomy beyond the solar system to galactic and extragalactic realms. From this point on, Kant turned increasingly to philosophical issues, although he would continue to write on the sciences throughout his life. In the early 1760s, Kant produced a series of important works in philosophy. The false subtlety of the four syllogistic figures, a work in logic, was published in 1762. Two more works appeared the following year. Attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes into philosophy, and the only possible augment in support of a demonstration of the existence of God. In 1764, Kant wrote observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, and then was second to Moses Mendelssohn in a Berlin Academy Prize competition with his inquiry concerning the distinction of the principles of natural theology and morality, often referred to as the prize essay. In 1770, at the age of 45, Kant was finally appointed professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. Kant wrote his inaugural dissertation in defense of this appointment. This work saw the emergence of several central themes of his mature work, including the distinction between the faculties of intellectual thought and sensible receptivity. Not to observe this distinction would mean to commit the error of subreption, and, as he says in the last chapter of the dissertation, only in avoidance of this error metaphysics will flourish. The Silent Decade. At the age of 46, Kant was an established scholar and an increasingly influential philosopher. Much was expected of him. In response to a letter from his student Marcus Hertz, Kant came to recognize that the inaugural dissertation he had failed to account for the relation and connection between our sensible and intellectual faculties. He also credited David Hume with awakening him from dogmatic slumber, circa 1770. Kant would not publish another work in philosophy for the next 11 years. Immanuel Kant spent his silent decade working on a solution to the problem posed though fond of company and conversation with others. Kant isolated himself, despite friends' attempts to bring him out of his isolation. In 1778, in response to one of these offers by a former pupil, Kant wrote, "Any change makes me apprehensive, even if it offers the greatest promise of improving my condition, and I am persuaded by this natural instinct of mine that I must take heed if I wish that the threads which the fates spin so thin and weak in my case to be spun at any length. My great thanks to my well-wishers and friends who think so kindly of me as to undertake my welfare, but at the same time a most humble request to protect me in my current condition from any disturbance." When Kant emerged from his silence in 1781, the result was the Critique of Pure Reason. Although now uniformly recognized as one of the greatest works in the history of philosophy, this critique was largely ignored upon its initial publication. The book was long, over 800 pages in the original German edition, and written in a dry, scholastic style. It received few reviews, and these granted no significance to the work. Its density made it, as Johann Gottfried Herder put it in a letter to Johann Greg Hamann, a tough nut to crack, obscured by all this heavy gossamer. This is in stark contrast, however, to the praise Kant received from early works such as the aforementioned prize essay, the other shorter works that precede the first critique. These well-received and readable tracts include one of the earthquake in Lisbon, which was so popular that it was sold by the page. Prior to the critical turn, this book sold well, and by the time he published Observations of the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime in 1764, he had become a popular author of some note. Kant was disappointed with the first critique's reception, recognizing the need to clarify the original treatise. Kant wrote the Prolegomena of any future metaphysics in 1783 as a summary of its main views. He also encouraged his friend Johann Schultz to publish a brief commentary on the Critique of Pure Reason. Karl's reputation gradually rose through the 1780s, sparked by a series of important works. In the 1784 essay, Answer to the Questions, What is Enlightenment? 1785's groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, his first work on moral philosophy, and from 1786, Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. But Kant's fame ultimately arrived from an unexpected source. In 1786, Karl Reinhold began to publish a series of public letters on the Kantian philosophy. In these letters, Reinhold framed Kant's philosophy as a response to the central intellectual controversy of the era, the pantheism dispute. Friedrich Jacobi had accused the recent deceased G.E. Lessing, a distinguished dramatic and philosophical essayist of Spinozism. Such a charge, tantamount to atheism, was vigorously denied by Lessing's friends, Moses Mendelssohn, and a bitter public dispute arose between them. The controversy gradually escalated into a great debate over the values of the Enlightenment and of reason itself. Reinhold maintained in his letter that Kant's critique of pure reason could settle this dispute by defending the authority and bounds of reason. Reinhold's letters were widely read and made Kant the most famous philosopher of his era. Kant's later works. Kant published the second aforementioned Critique of Pure Reason, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, in 1787, heavily revising the first parts of the book. Most of his subsequent work focused on other areas of philosophy. He continued to develop his moral philosophy, notably in 1788's Critique of Practical Reason, known as the Second Critique, and 1797's Metaphysics of Morals. The 1790 Critique of Judgment, the Third Critique, applied the Kantian system to aesthetics and teleology. He also wrote a number of semi-popular essays on history, religion, politics, and other topics. These works were well received by Kant's contemporaries and confirmed his preeminent status in 18th century philosophy. There were several journals devoted solely to defending and criticizing the Kantian philosophy. But despite his success, philosophical trends were moving in another direction. Many of Kant's most important disciples, including Reinhold, Beck, and Fichte, transformed the Kantian position into increasingly radical forms of idealism. This marked the emergence of German idealism. Kant opposed these developments and publicly denounced Fichte in an open letter in 1799. It was one of his final philosophical acts. Kant's health, long poor, took a turn for the worse, and he died in Königsberg on 12 February 1804, uttering, "Genug, enough." before expiring. His unfinished final work in fragmentary opus posthumum was, as its title suggested, published posthumously. A variety of popular beliefs have arisen concerning Kant's life. It is often held, for instance, that Kant was a late bloomer, that he only became an important philosopher in his mid-50s after rejecting his earlier views. While it is true that Kant wrote his greatest works relatively late in life, there is a tendency to underestimate the value of his earlier works. Recent Kant scholarship has devoted more attention to these pre-critical writings and has recognized a degree of continuity with his mature work. Many of the common myths concerning Kant's personal mannerisms are enumerated, explained, and refuted in Goldthwaite's translator's introduction to Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime. It is only held that Kant lived a very strict and predictable life, leading to the oft-repeated story that neighbors would set their clocks by his daily walks. He never married. Only later in his life, under the influence of his friends, the English merchant Joseph Green, did Kant adopt a more regulated lifestyle. Kant's philosophy. All or part of this article may be confusing or unclear. Please help clarify the article. Suggestions may be on the talk page, which was in March of 2008. Okay, Kant defined the Enlightenment in the essay answering the question, what is enlightenment, as an age shaped by Latin motto, sapere aude, dare to know. This involved thinking autonomously, free of the dictates of external authority. Kant's work reconciled many of the differences between the rationalist and empiricist traditions of the 18th century. He had a decisive impact on the Romantic and German idealist philosophies of the 19th century. His work has also been a starting point for many 20th century philosophers. Kant asserted that because of the limitation of reason, no one could really know if there is a God and an afterlife, and conversely, that no one could really know that there was not a God and an afterlife. For the sake of society and morality, Kant asserted people are reasonably justified in believing in them, even though they could never know for sure whether they are real or not. Kant explained, all the preparations of reason, therefore, in what may be called pure philosophy, are in reality directed to those three problems only: God, the soul, and freedom. However, these three elements in themselves still hold independent, proportional, objective weight individually. Moreover, in a collective relational context, namely, to know what ought to be done if the will is free, if there is a God, and if there is a future world. As this concerns our actions with reference to the highest aims of life, we see that the ultimate intention of nature in her wise provision was really in the constitution of our reason directed to moral interests only. The sense of an enlightened approach in the critical method required that if one cannot prove that a thing is, he may try to prove that it is not. If he succeeds in doing neither, as often occurs, he may still ask whether it is in his interest to accept one or the other of the alternatives, hypothetically, from the theoretical or the practical point of view. Hence the question no longer is as to whether perpetual peace is a real thing or not a real thing, or as to whether we may not be deceiving ourselves when we adopt the former alternative, but we must act on the supposition of its being real. The presupposition of God, soul, and freedom was then a practical concern, for morality by itself constitutes a system, but happiness does not, unless it is distributed in exact proportion to morality. This, however, is possible in an intelligible world only under a wise author and ruler. Reason compels us to admit such a ruler, together with life in such a world, which we must consider as future life, or else all moral laws are to be considered as idle dreams. The two interconnected foundations of what Kant called his critical philosophy of the Copernican revolution, which he claimed to have wrought in philosophy, were his epistemology of transcendental idealism and his moral philosophy of the autonomy of practical reason. These placed the active, rational human subject at the center of the cognitive and moral worlds with regard to knowledge. Kant argued that the rational order of the world as known by science could never be accounted for merely by the fortuitous accumulation of sense perception. It was instead the product of the rule-based activity of synthesis. This consisted of conceptual unification and integration carried out by the mind through concepts or the categories of the understanding operating on the perceptual manifold within space and time, which are not concepts, but forms of sensibility that are a priori necessary conditions for any possible experience. Thus, the objective order of nature and the causal necessity that operates within it are dependent upon the mind. There is wide disagreement among Kant scholars on the correct interpretation of this train of thought. The two-world interpretation regards Kant's position as a statement of epistemological limitation, that we are never able to transcend the bonds of our own mind, meaning that we cannot ascend the things in itself. Kant, however, also speaks of the thing in itself, or transcendental object, as a product of the human understanding, as it attempts to conceive an object in abstraction from the condition of sensibility. Following this thought, some interpreters have argued that the thing in itself does not represent a separate ontological domain, but simply a way of considering objects by means of the understanding alone. This is known as the two-aspect view. With regard to morality, Kant argued that the source of the good lies not in anything outside the human subject, either in nature or given by God, but rather only the good will itself. A good will is one that acts from duty in accordance with the universal moral law that the autonomous human being freely gives itself. The law obliges one to treat humanity understood as rational agency and represented through oneself as well as others, as in itself rather than merely as means. These ideas have largely framed or influenced all subsequent philosophical discussions and analysis. The specifics of Kant's account generated immediate and lasting controversy. Nevertheless, his thesis that the mind itself necessarily makes a constitutive contribution to its knowledge, that this contribution is transcendental rather than psychological, that philosophy involves self-critical activity, that morality is rooted in human freedom, and that to act autonomously is to act according to rational moral principles, have all had a lasting effect on subsequent philosophy. Kant's theory of perception. Main articles: The Critique of Pure Reason and Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Kant defines his theory of perception in his influential 1781 work, The Critique of Pure Reason, which has often been cited as the most significant volume of metaphysics and epistemology in modern philosophy. Kant maintains that our understanding of the external world has its foundations not merely in experience, but in both experience and priori concepts, thus offering a non-empiricist critique of rationalist philosophy, which is what he and others refer to as Copernican revolution. Copernican. Before discussing his theory, it is necessary to explain Kant's distinction between the analytic and synthetic propositions. An analytic proposition, a proposition whose prediction concept is contained in its subject concept, e.g., all bachelors are unmarried, where all bodies take up space. Synthetic proposition, a proposition whose predicate concept is not contained in its subject concept, e.g., all bachelors are happy, or all bachelors have mass. Analytic propositions are true by nature of the meaning of the word involved in the sentence. We require no further knowledge than a grasp of the language to understand this proposition. On the other hand, synthetic statements are those that tell us something about the world. Synthetic statements are true or false because their meanings transcend the content of the language used. In this instance, mass is not a necessary predicate to the body. until we are told the heaviness of the body. We do not know that it has mass. In this case, experience of the body is required before its heaviness becomes clear. Before Kant's first critique, empiricist C.F. Hume and rationalist C.F. Leibniz assumed that all synthetic statements require experience in order to be known. For more detail on this topic, see analytic synthetic distinction. Kant, however, contests this. He claims that elementary mathematics, like arithmetic, is synthetic a priori. Here Kant includes a priori and a posteriori concepts into his argument, and posts that it is in fact possible to have knowledge of the world that is not derived from empirical experience. Thus does Kant develop his argument for transcendental idealism. He justifies this by arguing that experience depends on certain necessary conditions, which he calls a priori forms, and that these conditions hold true for the world. In so doing, his main claims in the Transcendental Aesthetics are that mathematic judgments are synthetic in priori and in addition. Space and time are transcendentally ideal and at the same time are necessary conditions for experience. For more details on this topic, see a priori and a posteriori, which is philosophy. This is quite naturally confusing, yet Kant's idea is that since his first claim about mathematic judgments is true, then it will follow that his claims about space and time are true as well. The next paragraph deals with the notion of mathematic judgments being synthetic a priori. Skip to the paragraph afterwards to read more about perception of Kant. Once we have grasped the concepts of addition, subtraction, or the functions of basic arithmetic, we do not need any empirical experience to know that 100 plus 100 equals 200, and in this way it would appear that the arithmetic is in fact analytic. However, that it is analytic can be disproved thus. If the numbers 5 and 7 in the calculator 5 plus 7 equals 12 are examined, there is nothing to be found in them by which the number 12 can be inferred. Such it is that 5 plus 7 in the cube root of 1728 or 12 are not analytic, because their reference is the same but their sense is not, meaning that mathematic judgment 5 plus 7 equals 12 tells us something new about the world. It is self-evident and undeniably a priori, but at the same time it is synthetic. And so Kant proves a proposition can be synthetic and known a priori. For more details on this topic, see Sense and Reference. Kant asserts that perception is based both upon experience and external objects and a priori knowledge. The external world, he writes, provides those things which we sense. It is our mind, though, that processes this information about the world and gives it order, allowing us to comprehend it. Our mind supplies the conditions of space and time to experienced objects, according to the transcendental unity of apperception, the concept of the mind, understanding, and the intuitions which garner information from phenomena, sensibility, are synthesized by comprehension. Without the concepts, intuitions are nondescript. Without the intuitions, concepts are meaningless. Thus the famous quotation, intuitions without concepts are built. Concepts without intuitions are empty. Kant's categories of the understanding. Immanuel Kant deemed it obvious that we have some objective knowledge of the world, such as, say, Newtonian physics, but this knowledge relies on synthetic a priori laws of nature, like causality and substance. The problem, then, is how this is possible. Kant's solution was to reason that the subject must supply laws that make experience of objects possible, and that these laws are the synthetic a priori laws of nature, which we can know all objects are subject to prior to experiencing them, So to deduce all these laws, Kant examined experience in general, dissecting in it what is supplied by the mind from what is supplied by the given intuitions. This, which has just been explicated, is commonly called a transcendental reduction. To begin with, Kant's distinction between the posteriori being contingent and particular knowledge, and the priori being universal and necessary knowledge, must be kept in mind. For if we merely connect two intuitions together in a perceiving subject, the knowledge will always be subjective, because it is derived a posteriori, posteriori, when that is desired is for the knowledge to be objective, that is, for the two intuitions to refer to the object and hold good of it necessarily universally for anyone at any time, not just the perceiving subject in its current condition. Now, what is equivalent to object knowledge but the a priori, that is to say, universal and necessary knowledge? Nothing, and hence before knowledge can be objective. It must be incorporated under an a priori category of the understanding. For example, say a subject says, "The sun shines on the stone grows warm," which is all he perceives in perception. His judgment is contingent and holds no necessity. But if he says, "The sunshine causes the stone to warm," He subsumes the perception under the category of causality, which is not found in the perception, and necessarily synthesizes the concept sunshine with the concept heat, producing a necessary universally true judgment. To explain the categories in more detail, they are the preconditions of the construction of objects in the mind. Indeed, to even think of the sun and stone presupposes the category of subsistence, that is, substance. For the categories synthesize the random data of the sensory manifold into intelligible objects. This means that the categories are also the most abstract things one can say of any object whatsoever, and hence one can have an a priori cognition of the total of all objects of experience if one can list all of them. To do this, Kant formulates another transcendental reduction. Judgments are for Kant the preconditions of any thought. Man thinks via judgments, so all possible judgments must be listed in the perceptions connected within them, put aside, so the moments the understanding is involved in constructing judgments can be examined. For the categories are equivalent to these moments, in that they are concepts of intuitions in general, so far as they are determined by these moments universally and necessarily. Thus, by listing all the moments, one can deduce from them all the categories. One may now ask, how many possible judgments are there? Kant believed that all the possible propositions with Aristotle's syllogistic logic are equivalent to all possible judgments, and that all the logical operators within the propositions are equivalent to the moments of the understanding within judgments. Thus he listed Aristotle's system in 4 groups of 3: quantity, universal, particular, singular; quality, affirmative, negative, infinite; relation, categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive; and modality, problematic, assertoric, apodeictic. The parallelism with Kant's categories is obvious: quantity, unity; plurality, totality; quality, reality; negation, limitation; relation, substance, cause, community; and modality, possibility, existence, necessity. The fundamental building blocks of experience, i.e., objective knowledge, are now in place. First, there is the sensibility, which supplies the mind with intuitions, and then there is the understanding, which produces judgments of these intuitions and can subsume them under categories. These categories lift the intuitions up out of the subject's current state of consciousness and places them within consciousness in general, producing universally necessary knowledge. for the category are innate in any rational being. So any intuition thought within a category in one mind will necessarily be subsumed and understood identically in any mind. Kant's schema. Kant ran into a problem with his theory that the mind plays a part in producing objective knowledge. Intuitions and categories are entirely disparate. So how can they interact? Kant's solution is the schema, a priori principles by which the transcendental imagination connects concepts with intuitions through time. All the principles are temporarily bound, for if a concept is purely a priori, as the categories are, then they must apply for all times. Hence, there are principles such as substance is that which endures through time, and the cause must always be priori to the effect. Moral philosophy. Immanuel Kant developed his moral philosophy in 3 works: Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals in 1785, Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, and Metaphysics of Morals in 1797. In the groundwork, Kant's method involves trying to convert our everyday, obvious, rational knowledge of morality into philosophical knowledge. The latter 2 works followed a method of using practical reason, which is based only upon things about which reason can tell us, and not deriving any principles from experience, to reach conclusions which are able to be applied to the world of experience. In the second part of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant is known for his theory that there is a single moral obligation, which he called the categorical imperative, and is derived from the concept of duty. Kant defines the demands of the moral law as categorical imperatives. Categorical imperatives are principles that are intrinsically valid. They are good in and of themselves. They must be obeyed in all situations and circumstances if our behavior is to observe the moral law. It is from the categorical imperative that all other moral obligations are generated, and by which all moral obligations can be tested. Kant also stated that the moral means and ends can be applied to the categorical imperative that rational beings can pursue certain ends using the appropriate means. Ends that are based on physical needs or wants will always give for merely hypothetical imperatives. The categorical imperative, however, may be based only on something that is an end in itself, that is an end that is a means only to itself and not to some other need, desire, or purpose. He believed that the moral law is a principle of reason itself and is not based on contingent facts about the world, such as what would make us happy, but to act upon the moral law, which has no other motive than worthiness of being happy. Accordingly, he believed that moral obligation applies to all and only rational agents. A categorical imperative is an unconditional obligation, that is, it has the force of an obligation regardless of our will or desires. Contrast this with hypothetical imperative. In Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals in 1785, Kant enumerated 3 formulations of the categorical imperative which he believed to be roughly equivalent. Kant believed that if an action is not done with the motive of duty, then it is without moral value. He thought that every action should have pure intention behind it, otherwise it was meaningless. He didn't necessarily believe that the final result was the most important aspect of an action, but that how the person felt while carrying out the action was the time at which value was set to the result. In Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, Kant also posited the counter-utilitarian idea that there is a difference between preferences and values, and that considerations of individual rights temper calculations of aggregate utility, a concept that is an axiom in economics. Everything is either a price or a dignity. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. On the other hand, whatever is above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. But that which constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself does not have mere relative worth, i.e. price, but an intrinsic worth, i.e. dignity. Page 53, italics in original. The first formulation. The first formula of universal law of the moral imperative requires that the maxims be chosen as though they should hold as universal laws of nature. 436:29. This formulation, in principle, has as its supreme law always acted according to what the maxim whose universality as a law you can at the same time will, and is the only condition under which a will can never come into conflict with itself. One interpretation of the first formulation is called the universality test. An agent's maxim, according to Kant, is his subjective principle of human actions. That is, what the agent believes is his reason to act. The universality test has 5 steps. Find the agent's maxim. The maxim is an action paired with its motivation. Example, I will lie for personal benefit. Lying is the action. The motivation is to get what you desire. Paired together, they form the maxim. Imagine a possible world in which everyone in a similar position to the real-world agent followed that maxim. Decide whether any contradiction or irrationalities arise in the possible world as a result of following the maxim. If a contradiction or irrationality arises, acting on that maxim is not allowed in the real world. If there is no contradiction, then acting on that maxim is permissible and in some instances required. For a modern parallel, see John Rawls' Hypothetical Situations, the original position. The second formulation, formula of the end in itself, says that the rational being, as by its nature an end, and thus as an end in itself, must serve in every maxim as the condition restricting all merely relative and arbitrary ends. The principle is, act with reference to every rational being, whether yourself or another, so that it is an end in itself in your maxim, meaning the rational being is the basis of all maxims of action, and must be treated never as a mere means but as the supreme limiting conditions in the use of all means, i.e., as an end at the same time. The third formulation, formula of autonomy, is a synthesis of the first two and is the basis for the complete determination of all maxims. It says that all maxims which stem from autonomous legislation ought to harmonize with a possible realm of ends as with the realm of nature. In principle, so act as if your maxims should serve at the same time as the universal law of all rational beings, meaning that we should so act that we may think of ourselves as a member of the universal realm of ends, legislating universal laws through our maxims in a possible realm of ends. See also Kingdom of Ends. Okay. Idea of God. Kant stated the practical necessity for a belief in God in his critique of pure reason. As an idea of pure reason, we do not have the slightest ground to assume in an absolute manner the object of this idea, but adds that the idea of God cannot be separated from the relation of happiness with morality as the idea of the supreme good. The foundation of this connection is an intelligible moral world, and is necessary from the practical point of view. Later in the logic, funny looking symbol 3, which was in 1800, he argued that the idea of God can only be proved through the moral law and only with practical intent, that is, the intent so as to act as if there there be a God. Translation Hartman and Swartz. See argument for morality in more details. Idea of freedom. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant distinguishes between the transcendental idea of freedom, which is a psychological concept, is mainly empirical and refers to the question of whether we must admit a power of spontaneously beginning a series of successive things or states as a real ground of necessity in regard to causality, and the practical concept of freedom as the independence of our will from the coercion or necessation through sensuous impulses. Kant finds it a source of difficulty that the practical concept of freedom is founded on the transcendental idea of freedom, but for the sake of practical interest uses the practical meaning, taking no account of its transcendental meaning, which he feels was properly disposed of in the third antinomy, and as an element in the question of the freedom of the will is for philosophy a real stumbling block that has embarrassed speculative reason. Kant calls practical everything that is possible through freedom, and the pure practical laws that are never given through sensuous conditions are held analogously with the universal law of causality, are moral laws. Reason can give us only the pragmatic laws of free action through the senses, but pure practical laws given by reason a priori dictate what ought to be done. Aesthetic philosophy. Kant discusses the subjective nature of aesthetic qualities and experiences in Observations of the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime in 1764. Kant's contribution to aesthetic theory is developed in the Critique of Judgment in 1790, where he investigates the possibility of logical status of judgments of taste. In the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, the first major division of the Critique of Judgment, Kant used the term aesthetic in a manner that is, according to Kant scholar W. H. Walsh, its modern sense. Prior to this, in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant had, in order to note the essential differences between judgments of taste, moral judgments, and scientific judgments, abandoned the use of the term aesthetics as laws a priori. After A. G. Baumgarten, who wrote Aesthetica in between 1750 to 1758, Kant was one of the first philosophers to develop and integrate aesthetic theory into the unified and comprehensive philosophical system, utilizing ideas that played an integral role throughout his philosophy. In the chapter Analytic of the Beautiful of the Critique of Judgment, Kant states that beauty is not a property of an artwork or natural phenomenon, but is instead a consciousness of the pleasure which attends the free play of the imagination and the understanding. Even though it appears that we are using reason to decide that which is beautiful, the judgment is not a cognitive judgment. It is consequently not logical, but aesthetical. A pure judgment of taste is in fact subjective insofar as it refers to the emotional response of the subject and is based upon nothing but esteem for an object itself. It is disinterested pleasure, and we feel that the pure judgment of taste, i.e. judgments of beauty, lay claim to universal validity. It is important to note that this universal validity is not derived from a determined concept of beauty, but from common sense. Kant also believed that a judgment of taste shares characteristics engaged in a moral judgment. Both are disinterested, and we hold them to be universal. In the chapter Analytic of the Sublime, Kant identifies the sublime as a aesthetic quality which, like beauty, is subjective, but unlike beauty, refers to an indeterminate relationship between the faculties of the imagination and of reason, and shares the character of moral judgments in the use of reason. The feeling of the sublime itself comprises of two distinct modes, the mathematical sublime and the dynamical sublime. Describe two subjective moments, both of which concern the relationship of the faculty of the imagination to reason. The mathematical sublime is situated in the failure of the imagination to comprehend natural objects which appear boundless and formless, or which appear absolutely great. 23 through 25. This imaginative failure is then recuperated through the pleasure taken in reason's assertion of the concept of infinity. In this move, the faculty of reason proves itself superior to our fallible, sensible self. 25 through 26. In the dynamical sublime, there is a sense of annihilation of the sensible self as the imagination tries to comprehend a vast might. This power of nature threatens us, but through the resistance of reason to such sensible annihilation, the subject feels a pleasure and a sense of the human moral vocation. This appreciation of moral feeling through exposure to the sublime helps to develop moral character. Kant had developed the distinction between an object of art as a material value subject to the conventions of society and the transcendental condition of the judgment of taste as a refined value in the propositions of his idea of a universal history. 1784. In the fourth and fifth thesis of that work, he identified all art as the fruits of unsociableness due to men's antagonism of society, and in the seventh thesis asserted that while such material property is indicative of a civilized state, only the idea of morality and the universalization of refined value through the improvement of the mind of man belongs to culture. Political philosophy. Main article: Political Philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. In 1795, Kant lists several conditions that he thought necessary for ending wars and creating a lasting peace. They included a world of constitutional republics. This was the first version of the democratic peace theory. He opposed democracy, which at his time meant direct democracy, believing that majority rule posed a threat to individual liberty. He stated democracy is, properly speaking, necessarily a despotism because it establishes an executive power in which all decide for or even against one who does not agree. That is, all who are not quite all decide, and this is a contradiction in general will with itself and with freedom. Anthropology. Kant lectured on anthropology for over 25 years. His Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View was published in 1798. This was the subject of Michael Foucault's doctoral dissertation. Kant's lecture of anthropology was published for the first time in 1997 in Germany. They have not been translated into English. Influence. Statue of Immanuel Kant in Kaliningrad, Russia. The vastness of Kant's influence on Western thought is immeasurable. During his own life, there was a considerable amount of attention paid to his thought, much of it critical, though he did have a positive influence on Reinhold, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and Novalis during the 1780s and 1790s. The philosophical movement known as German idealism developed from Kant's theoretical and practical writings. The German idealist Fichte and Schelling, for example, attempted to bring traditional metaphysically laden notions like the absolute God or being with the confines of Kant's critical philosophy. In so doing, the German idealists attempted to reverse Kant's establishment of the unknowableness of unexperienceable ideas. Hegel was one of the first major critics of Kant's philosophy. Hegel thought Kant's moral philosophy was too formal, abstract, and ahistorical. In response to Kant's abstract and formal account of morality, Hegel developed an ethics that considered the ethical life of the community. But Hegel's notion of ethical life is meant to subsume rather than replace Kantian morality, and Hegel's philosophical works as a whole can be understood as attempting to defend Kant's conception of freedom as going beyond finite inclinations by means of reason. Thus, in contrast to later critics like Friedrich Nietzsche or Bertrand Russell, Hegel shares some of Kant's most basic concerns. Many British Roman Catholic writers, notably G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, seized on Kant and promoted his work with a view of restoring the philosophical legitimacy of a belief in God. Reaction against this and an attack on Kant's use of language is found in Ronald Inglefeld's article Kant as Defender of the Faith in 19th Century England, reprinted in Critique of Pure Verbiage, Essays of Abuses of Language in Literature, Religious and Philosophical Writings. Author Schopenhauer was strongly influenced by Kant's transcendental idealism. He, like J. E. Schultz, Jacobi, and Fichte before him, was critical of Kant's theory of the thing in itself. Things in themselves, they argued, are neither the cause of or representation of our representations, nor are they something completely beyond our access. For Schopenhauer, things in themselves do not exist independently on the non-rational will. The world, as Schopenhauer would have it, is the striving and largely unconscious will. With the success and wide influence of Hegel's writings, Kant's influence began to wane, though there was in Germany a brief moment that held a return to Kant in the 1860s, beginning with the publication of Kant und die Epogonen in 1865 by Otto Liebmann, whose motto was "Back to Kant." During the turn of the 20th century, there was an important revival of Kant's theoretical philosophy known as Marburg Neo-Kantianism, represented in the work of Hermann Cohen, Paul Netorp, Ernst Cassirer, and anti-Neo-Kantian Nikolai Hartmann. Jürgen Habermas and John Rawls are two significant political and moral philosophers whose work is strongly influenced by Kant's moral philosophy. They both, regardless of recent relativist trends in philosophy, have argued that universality is essential to any viable moral philosophy. West Germany postage stamp, 1974, commemorating the 25th anniversary of Kant's birth, or the 250th anniversary of Kant's birth. With his Perpetual Peace, Kant is considered to have foreshadowed many of the ideas that have come to form from democratic peace theory, one of the main controversies in political science. Kant's notion of critique or criticism have been quite influential. The early German Romantics, especially Friedrich Schlegel, in his Athenaeum fragments, used Kant's self-reflexive conception of criticism in their romantic theory of poetry. Also, in aesthetics, Clement Greenberg, in his classic essays, Modernist Painting, uses Kantian criticisms, what Greenberg refers to as immanent criticism, to justify the aims of abstract paintings, a movement Greenberg saw as aware of the key limitation, flatness, that makes up the medium of painting. Kant believed that mathematical truths were forms of synthetic or priori knowledge, which means they are necessary and universal, yet known through intuition. Kant's often brief remarks about mathematics influenced the mathematical schools known as institutionalism, a movement of philosophy of mathematics opposed to Hilbert's formalism and the logicism of Frege and Bertrand Russell. Post-Kantian philosophy has yet to return to the style of thinking and arguing that characterized much of philosophy and metaphysics before Kant. Although many British and American philosophers have preferred to trace their intellectual origins to Hume, thus bypassing Kant, the British philosopher P.F. Strawson is a notable exception, as is the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars. Due in part to the influence of Strawson and Sellars, among others, there has been a renewed interest in Kant's view of the mind, central to many debates in philosophy of psychology and cognitive science is Kant's conception of the unity of consciousness. Tomb and statue in Kaliningrad. Again, excuse me for mispronunciations. Immanuel Kant's tomb today. Plaque on a wall in Kaliningrad in Germany and Russia with the words taken from the conclusions of Kant's critique of practical reason. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. The wall is next to where the southwest part of Königsberg Castle used to be. Kant's tomb is today in the mausoleum adjoining the northeast corner of Königsberg Cathedral. The mausoleum was constructed by the architect Friedrich Lars and was finished in 1924 in time for the bicentennial of Kant's birth. Originally, Kant was buried inside the cathedral, but in 1880 his remains were moved outside and placed in a neo-Gothic chapel adjoining the northeast corner of the cathedral. Over the years, the chapel became dilapidated before it was demolished to make way for the mausoleum, which was built on the same spot where it is today. The tomb and its mausoleum are some of the few artifacts of German times preserved by the Soviets after they conquered and annexed the city. Today, many newlyweds bring flowers to the mausoleum. A replica of the statue of Kant that stood in German times in front of the main University of Kaliningrad building was donated by a German entity in the early 1990s and placed in the same grounds. Well, that is the end of the reading, and it took an hour and a half. I hope you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please like, subscribe, share, make comments, and give some feedback.